We are recording.
Well, welcome everyone. It is April 20th, and we are here tonight with my friend and colleague, Dr. David K. Johnson. We're going to be talking tonight about the Lavender Scare and hidden histories. And we're going to hear a lot about the good work that Dr. Johnson's done over his career. And then also, we're going to be talking at the end of his discussion about the Lavender Scare about how teachers can use this practically every day in their classroom. So we're really excited about that. We're honored to have Dr. Johnson here with us today. As a quick introduction, we just want to say hi real quick. My name is Christopher Lee. I'm a teacher induction and social studies consultant at Oakland Schools. And Stacy?
I'm Stacy Woodward, and I'm a disciplinary literacy and social studies consultant at Oakland Schools. Welcome.
Hi, everyone. I'm Molly Gale. I'm a social studies consultant at Oakland Schools.
Wonderful. Thanks, y'all. And what we're going to be talking about today, the question that's going to be driving us is how can we use sources about hidden histories like the Lavender Scare to help students better understand the past and navigate the present? We really believe that this topic is not only helpful in terms of helping students understand the past, but there's a lot of relevance for today's world and how students can navigate the civic world that they're operating in today. And to do that, we're going to be talking, like I said, with Dr. David K. Johnson. Now, this is his book, his first book, if I remember right, The Lavender Scare, the Cold War Persecution of Gays and Lesbians in the Federal Government. And the picture that we have here in the middle is of Frank Kameny, one of the many characters in Dr. Johnson's book. I would say probably the main character in his book, who is not just a character, but a real character, very colorful personality, but also has a real important story to tell all of us. Dr. Johnson is a professor of history at the University of South Florida. As I mentioned, he's the author of The Lavender Scare, which has won 3 National Book Awards and was the basis for a PBS documentary film. He also helped found the LGBTQ collections within the special collections at the USF Library. He was a professor of mine, and he's an incredible scholar and teacher and a great human being. So we're honored to have him tonight. We're really looking forward to what he has to say. And with that, we're going to go ahead and turn it over to him right now. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And Dr. Johnson, if you could go ahead and share, and we're excited to hear what you have to say tonight.
Thank you, Chris. And thanks to Stacy and Molly, too, for inviting me here. I'm very happy to be here, especially today, since the Department of Education in my state of Florida has decided that the K through 12 teachers can't talk about sexual orientation. So I have to go to you folks in Michigan to try to get you to incorporate discussions of the Lavender Scare in your classrooms. So let me share here. Oops. There we go. Right, hidden histories, the Lavender Scare. So I'll just start out by kind of defining the Lavender Scare. It was a moral panic, really, right? It was a fear that kind of permeated Cold War political culture. It was a fear that gay people had infiltrated the federal government, that they posed a threat to national security, and that they needed to be systematically removed from government service. It was a kind of cultural panic, not unlike, in fact, the one we're arguably going through now. But it had serious repercussions. It became a federal government policy that lasted in some ways for 20 years. And it affected thousands of people's lives. So I'm going to start out talking about the kind of origins of this moral panic, and then talk about how it got involved in politics, even presidential politics, and then talk about how it impacted individual gay and lesbian people. And I mean, I think if you're going to incorporate, which I hope you do, are able to incorporate this into your classroom discussions, it's pretty easy. If you already talk about the Cold War in any way, if you talk about Joseph McCarthy, if you talk about the Red Scare, this is not a heavy lift, because it's my argument that you can't really understand the full implications of the Red Scare unless you also talk about the Lavender Scare, that they were intrinsically related. And so it begins, and we can pinpoint the beginning of this pretty precisely. It's the famous moment in Wheeling, West Virginia, where Joseph McCarthy, who up until that point had been a fairly obscure junior senator, had not gotten a lot of press, but he gives a speech, this Lincoln Day address, where he says that he holds in his hand a list, right? A list of 202 card-carrying communists currently working for the State Department, he claimed, with the knowledge of the Secretary of State. And in some ways, that claim was fairly unremarkable. People had been saying similar things about the State Department for quite some time, but he gets a lot of attention, a lot of media attention, and now it's become this famous moment in American history because of the list, right? Because he claimed to have evidence of what he first called 202 card-carrying communists. But what even people who teach this fairly regularly don't realize is those charges kept changing, right? At first, there were 202 card-carrying communists. Later, there were 57 of them. Later, there were 87 of them. And the designation kept changing. They started out as card-carrying communists. They became, were called other things: loyalty risks, security risks. And a couple of weeks after the initial speech in Wheeling, West Virginia, when McCarthy takes to the floor of the Senate and he gives specifics about this list, and it turns out that they're not all communists. It turns out that at least two of the actually groups of people on the list were homosexual. And in explaining this, McCarthy says, well, he says, you'll find that practically every active communist is twisted mentally or physically in some way. And here with this little story, McCarthy is already making this connection, right, between communists and homosexuals, saying they're both evidence of some sort of twistedness, mental or physical twistedness. We'll come back to that, those connections. The State Department has to respond to these allegations, of course, right? Secretary of State Dean Acheson, he appears on Capitol Hill for some other matter. He's questioned very intensely about these charges that are getting lots of attention. And he initially says, oh, no communists here in the State Department. We haven't fired any, we haven't found any, nothing here, nothing to see here. But under very intense questioning by McCarthy's Republican allies, he does admit that the State Department has fired 202 people it considers to be security risks. And the senators want to know more about these 202 security risks. Who were they? What were they? If they're not actually communists, what are they? He admits that they're in some sort of shady category. He talks about people of moral weakness. And finally, the senators get him to admit that, well, most of them were homosexuals. So he used lots of euphemisms before he got around to actually using the word homosexual. He said that 91 of them were homosexual. And this seems to corroborate Joseph McCarthy's charges that, something's wrong with the State Department, that there are homosexuals there. We're not sure about the communists, but there actually were homosexuals there. So it sets off this Lavender Scare. It sets off this panic. Rather than assuage people, which could have been the reaction, right? People could have said, oh, great, you found these people, you fired them, end of story, right? But that's not how a moral panic works. People were concerned, why did you hire these people to begin with? And where did they go? Did they go to other government agencies? So it confirms McCarthy's charges. It is one of the reasons why he's so popular. He gets lots of mail. He got about 25,000 letters of support. Those letters are actually still under seal in the Marquette University Library. So I have not seen them, but the journalists who looked at them at the time said that most of the letter writers were not concerned about communists. They were concerned about this evidence of sex depravity in the State Department. Truman's advisors, President Truman's advisors, advised him about the same thing. They said the country seems to be more concerned about the charges about homosexuals than communists in the State Department. And a lot of the materials about Joseph McCarthy and his charges, they will often suggest that there are two parts to the charges. Sometimes they use euphemisms, right? Sometimes they were not able to, say homosexual, depending on the venue. This is actually a matchbook cover that I put up here in support of Joseph McCarthy in his fight against treason and dishonor, right? There were two parts to it. The treason part obviously refers to the communist allegations. The dishonor part, you might not know, right? If you weren't following the story, if you didn't know about the allegations, but when you know that it's about homosexuals, right? That's clearly a euphemism. Right? Treason and dishonor. So in the summer of 1950, after these allegations, there's a series of increasingly broad and expensive congressional investigations into this problem, into McCarthy's charges. Were they really homosexuals in the government, and were they really a threat to national security? Right? Congress wanted to get answers to this. And this Herblock cartoon is kind of making fun of the senators, right? Looking at this issue, saying their vote to investigate perversion. It suggests that maybe they're a little too interested in this story. Herblock, by the way, he's the cartoonist who is credited with coming up with the very term McCarthyism. So he's a kind of a big deal in the 50s. But it was a pretty serious undertaking. Right? They bring forth lots of witnesses. They ask police officers, vice officers, intelligence officers, security officials to testify. And all of them say, yes, absolutely. This was a problem of potential blackmail. That gay people were in the closet, they were hiding, they could be blackmailed into revealing state secrets, and therefore, they should be removed from the government. But they couldn't find any evidence for it. They would ask the witnesses, do you have any evidence? Do you have any examples? And they didn't have any. By that point, this is a bipartisan effort. This is the head of the committee, Senator Clyde Huey. He's a Democrat because the Democrats are in charge of the Senate at that point. That's Margaret Chase Smith next to him, the Republican senator from Maine. Margaret Chase Smith famously stood up to Joseph McCarthy. She thought his methods were horrible and denounced him. But she participated in these hearings against homosexuals, participated fully. Right? So they're looking for evidence. They don't have any, despite all of these witnesses, but they still publish a report at the end of the year in December 1950. It's about the employment of homosexuals and other sex perverts in the government. It's sort of informally called the Huey Committee Report, where they conclude very definitively that gay people are a threat to national security. They say the lack of emotional stability, which is found in most sex perverts, and the weaknesses of their moral fiber make them vulnerable to the blandishments of the foreign agent. Right? And they called for a wholesale purge of these people from the federal government. Again, without any real evidence. The only thing they could point to was this guy, Colonel Alfred Radel. He was head of Austrian intelligence in the beginning of the 20th century, the run up to World War One. He was, in fact, a double agent. He worked for the Russians, and he was apparently gay, or at least bisexual. But the blackmail part of it, they had to make up. He was not blackmailed into doing this. He did this apparently for the money. We don't really know the story. When it was discovered, he committed suicide. But that's the only piece of evidence they had. So even in 1950, this is evidence from 40 years ago. One guy in another country, right? So they had no evidence of any American citizens in the recent past who had betrayed government secrets under threat of blackmail. And yeah, Colonel Radel sometimes, at least in tabloid magazines, gets blamed for the beginning of World War One. So I just want to stop here and say, what are the connections? I mean, I often ask my students, so, why were they firing these people? Why was McCarthy concerned? Why was the country concerned? What did they say were the connections between communists and homosexuals? And just yell something out if you.
So it sounds like there is this idea that homosexuals, more than heterosexuals, are more given to being blackmailed because their sexuality is taboo in society, and so they fear that homosexuals would be more likely to betray their government because they don't want their sexuality revealed to their family, friends, peer groups, etc.
Right. So one connection is through blackmail, right? Which is to say, it's not that homosexuals are communists, right? It's just that they could be used by communists, right? That there's no intrinsic connection. It's just because of the blackmail thing, they could become tools, basically, of communists, right? But are there any other ways in which these two groups are linked?
That's what I was going to say, is that there's definitely they use that correlation of almost that fear of blackmail to be outed without their own consent of doing so. And especially in this time, it was incredibly taboo to even be remotely associated with the LGBTQ plus community, which didn't publicly exist. The other thing that I found too that it was interesting is inherently, as in being in a capitalist society, anything other than, and especially in this time of extreme nationalism of both countries pitted against each other, communism seems so other and so inferior, if you will. And same applied for the taboos of the LGBTQ plus society of what did exist for it. Therefore, the mental wickedness or the twistedness of the inconceivability that anyone could ever participate in, believe in, agree in, or even perpetuate this. It seemed that he drew quite the correlation between those two things, both of which I appreciate that you said were unfounded and didn't have evidence or data behind that as well.
Right. Excellent. Yes. So even though the sort of official connection is through blackmail, there are all these other ways in which the groups kind of get conflated, right? They're both considered weak in some way, either psychologically weak, right? Because no sane person could be a communist, right? It must be evidence of some sort of psychological disturbance. Same thing with homosexuality. And sometimes, right, and you're right, because it's all about the Cold War, the way we view communism and the Soviet Union. And yes, it's about capitalism versus communism. It's sort of an economic thing, but it was also a moral struggle, right? Communists are atheists, right? So they're considered to be immoral, and of course homosexuals are immoral as well. So there's all these other ways in which the two groups are kind of considered suspect, right? Even if that's not the official rationale.
I actually have a question. When you were talking about the, trying to find evidence to back up the allegations, were you talking about looking for evidence that they were homosexual, or looking for evidence that they were communists, or either?
Not actually, I was talking about looking for evidence that any gay person had ever been blackmailed into revealing secrets.
Okay.
That had never happened. So there was no, because that's the fear, right? The fear is that this is going to happen. These people are going to give away our state secrets, our nuclear secrets, under threat of blackmail. And yet they couldn't point to a single example of anyone who had actually done that ever. And still to this day, actually can't. So yeah, it's crazy. Senator Bridges, one of McCarthy's allies, he made the connection this way. He said, homosexuals in the State Department did not get there by osmosis or by accident. They got there because Stalin wanted them there, right? As if he had some sort of control, right? And another person or another tabloid said this was Stalin's atom bomb to destroy American civilization by infiltrating the government with homosexuals. So there were all these various ways that these groups are put together. This is from a tabloid at the time, I think it's Confidential, talking about Washington's growing homosexual menace. And it specifically mentions the idea of blackmail, right? There is no room for perverted officials in our government. These men, wide open to blackmailers, could destroy the security of this country with one vile act. But there was also the moral issue. When Dean Acheson defends his employees who are being maligned by Joseph McCarthy in the press, his response is to say that my employees are honorable, loyal, and clean living American men and women, right? So he's putting this in under the moral category. They're not homosexuals, right? They're clean living American men and women. Again, this sort of two-part response to McCarthy. They're loyal and clean living. This is a newspaper piece on the issue featuring George Kennan. He was, of course, the man responsible for the containment policy, or the idea of the containment policy. Big State Department official. He's actually one of the few people who comes out and says, this really probably isn't a matter of national security. I think this is, people are taking this too far. But in the article about his speech, right, it all uses the euphemism of morals to talk about it. They talk about security risks in the State Department. They talk about employees charged with loose morals and morals cases, all to avoid what is this? The New York Herald Tribune, to avoid using the term homosexuals, although everyone knew that's what they were talking about. Anyone who was paying attention, anyway.
Dr. Johnson.
Yeah.
Is there any evidence at all that security risks or loose morals or anything like that had to do with infidelity in a heterosexual relationship? Because that's something that's never really crossed my mind up until now, but was there any evidence at all that those references were, at least in some cases, to those kinds of incidents?
No, that wasn't a big, wasn't a big concern. Some people raised it like, hey, what about, those people would be threats to national security too, but it wasn't taken seriously. I guess I would say one of the big differences is that, gay men at the time could be arrested, right, for well, it's rarely sodomy, sometimes sodomy. It was more likely just disorderly conduct or something in a known gay cruising area. It's much less likely to happen to a philandering heterosexual, right, to actually be arrested. So But this is it's part of this larger moral concern going on in the Cold War, which is considered this moral struggle. It's a quote from an insurance company president who claims that the first thing that communists would do would be to destroy the family as a unit, because by destroying the family, they destroyed the basis of a free way of life. Right? So you can see why they would put homosexuals on, the other side of this kind of Cold War moral struggle. And it's part of that Cold War moral struggle was a sense that the United States needed to morally rearm, to remind people, right, that we're fighting this moral battle with the Soviet Union, and we need to, shore up our own moral bona fides. One of the things famously the United States does is add "under God" to the Pledge of Allegiance in this period. All part of a Cold War moral crusade. But I also want to talk about how this influences presidential politics, how McCarthy and his Republican allies, they use this to win elections. So it wasn't just a sort of cultural moral panic, and it eventually becomes a federal government policy through the 1952 presidential election. That was the first presidential election since Joseph McCarthy rose to power in 1950. Of course, it was a contest between the Republican Dwight Eisenhower and the Democratic candidate Adlai Stevenson. And issues of homosexuality came up in subtle ways during the campaign. Adlai Stevenson was called various names by his Republican opponents. He was seen as kind of an intellectual. They called him an egghead. They said he had a fruity voice. He was a former State Department official at a time when the State Department was under great scrutiny for both communism and homosexuality. The FBI actually spread a rumor that he was arrested on a sex charge in New York. He was the sort of person that people didn't want to send to Washington, but wanted to, get out of Washington. And perhaps most damaging for his sort of reputation as a heterosexual man, he was divorced, right? At a time when divorce was still considered, a kind of moral failing in America. There hadn't been a divorced president at that time. That wouldn't happen until Ronald Reagan was elected president. So there was lots of talk about Adlai Stevenson's divorce and what was the reason for his divorce. And the Republicans tried to emphasize the fact that Adlai Stevenson did not have a wife. And if you voted for Adlai Stevenson, there would be no first lady. And why was that? Did that have anything to do with these rumors about his alleged arrest? And you can see this kind of theme in the Republican campaign literature and their slogan. Their slogan in 1952 was "Let's clean house," right? Let's get rid of all of these subversives and undesirables, communists, homosexuals that had infiltrated the federal government over the last, at that point, the Democrats had been in control for 20 years, right? Since 1932 through Roosevelt and Truman. We want to sweep all those people out. They portrayed Eisenhower and Nixon as regular guys. They were God-fearing men who were for morality. Right? What does that mean? Well, that means your opponents apparently are not for morality, right? They are for these, protecting these homosexuals and communists in the government. They appeared with their families, with their children as often as possible. The Nixons appeared with their 2 daughters, and the Eisenhowers trotted out their grandchildren in order to demonstrate that they were good family men representing family values. And they made appearances with their wives We now sort of take that for granted. Presidential candidates always appear with their spouses. And they had occasionally before, but it's really in the 1952 election that it becomes a regular feature, because they wanted to remind voters that, there was no Mrs. Stevenson, right? And why was that? So they win, of course. The Republicans win in a landslide. Eisenhower is president. And one of the first things he does as president is to expand Truman's loyalty program, which had focused mostly on loyalty, on issues of communism, membership in a communist or communist friendly organization, and expanded it into a broader security program. It's Executive Order 10450. You'll notice it was signed April 27th, 1953. We're coming up on the 70th anniversary of that just next week. And so this represented a switch, right? Less concern about loyalty, which is really about communism, and more concerned about these other things. Here you see the partial list of what they're concerned about, right? Any criminal, infamous, dishonest, immoral, or notoriously disgraceful conduct, habitual use of intoxicants, drug addiction, or sexual perversion. It was really focused on character, on suitability, on trustworthiness, not about anything that anyone had actually done that was a threat to national security, but things that someone might do in the future. And it allowed Eisenhower and Nixon to boast the next year that they were kicking the communists and fellow travelers and security risks out of the government by the thousands, not by the hundreds, but by the thousands, right? And that formulation is important there. Communists, fellow travelers, and security risks, right? What is a security risk in that sentence? Right? I mean, it's kind of like the earlier versions we've seen, right, of treason and dishonor, right? It's like two parts, communists and homosexuals is really what it's saying, but they couldn't use the word homosexual. So they used the word security risk, which often functioned as a euphemism for homosexual, right? It was about, as I said, character, suitability. Any other types of people you would think of as security risks? It might give away secrets.
I mean, people who are in debt have a hard time getting security clearances, right?
Yes, and now actually that is and as it should be, I think the focus of most security clearance problems is about, is focused on money. It wasn't so much then, though. Yeah.
I'm thinking maybe people they thought were spies.
Yeah, a spy certainly would be a security risk for sure.
Maybe
that-
people who just had, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Maybe people who just had family that lived in other countries that maybe didn't work in the government but had other family
Yes.
connection.
Yes, that's good. They could be vulnerable to blackmail because of the family member, right? Who was overseas, whatever.
In this context, probably people who aren't married,
Who aren't married.
like single men and women, who are maybe of a certain age.
Yes, although that's mostly because, well, that must mean, maybe that means they're gay. Maybe that means, I don't know. Yeah, there's right. The two other groups most talked about were alcoholics, because they might drink too much and reveal secrets, or just people who, even without alcohol, were, loquacious and talkative and talk too much. So people who drank too much, people who talked too much, and gay people were basically the biggest categories of security risks. And it was really the gay people that they most focused on. Like I said, most of the times, I mean, I think it's fair to say security risk was basically a euphemism for homosexual. It sounds like it's about spying and communism and, you know, national security things, right? But it's not. It's about character, it's about suitability, it's about things you might be forced to do in the future, right? You have not committed any crime. And it helps them win elections. We don't know whether Eisenhower, in fact, believed that this was, you know, a necessary measure for national security, but certainly his aides realized that this slogan, "Let's clean house," and this rhetoric about getting rid of security risks helped the Republican Party. I received a letter from a Freedom of Information Act request that I made. They sometimes take years. This one took several years. It came to me after I finished the book, and it was from the head of security of the State Department to the Secretary of State, where he told the secretary that it is not enough to clean up the mess in Washington, but also it is necessary that the administration expose the extent of this mess, making a record which will enable candidates of the Republican Party to seek re-election for many years to come. It's kind of a smoking gun, right? For the fact that they knew this was winning elections, whether they believed it was necessary either morally or in terms of national security, maybe not, but they certainly knew it was winning elections. So it becomes this federal government policy. What started out as this kind of crazy conspiracy theory of Joseph McCarthy, by 1953, it's a federal government policy. It affects all government workers. The federal government is the largest employer in the nation, and everyone who works for it or has a security clearance has to pass an investigation. So I want to talk a little bit about what that was like, right, for the average person. And I'm going to use Madeline Tress as an example. I was able to interview her before she passed away. We have her federal, her FBI file, thanks to the Freedom of Information Act. So we know that she was a 25-year-old woman working for the Department of Commerce in 1953. She had a great record. She had great credentials. She had a BA from Georgetown School of Foreign Service. She had an MA from NYU. But like all federal workers at the time, right, she was subject to investigation. So these security officials would interview people's neighbors, their coworkers, their former bosses, their former teachers, and compile information about them. In the case of Madeline Tress, they got comments like she was not at all feminine, she was mannish in appearance. One professor said that she was homosexual actively and well known. And it often took just one of these comments from, you know, some stray person to have them open up what was called a full field investigation. They would investigate even, you know, more people, family members, roommates, as they did with Madeline Tress. She remembered it was actually in a day in April in 1958 when two FBI agents came into her desk when she was working at the Department of Commerce. People kind of lived in fear that security official might approach them. And sure enough, they approached her. They asked her to come with them. They took her to another room. They had her do an oath, you know, to tell the truth. She asked if she could have an attorney. They said no, she could not have an attorney. And then they asked her this question that really changed her life. They said, the civil service has information that you are homosexual. What comment do you care to make? And like a lot of people in this situation, Madeline Tress froze. She didn't know which was worse. She knew if she lied about the situation, she could be fired for lying. She knew if she told the truth, she would probably be fired for that. So she said she wouldn't answer the question. But these guys had more questions for her. They wanted to know if she had ever been to the Redskins Lounge, which was a gay and lesbian bar in DC. Thinking there was nothing illegal about it, she admitted she had been to the bar. She said she liked the music there. The investigators assumed that she went there to make what they called homosexual contacts. They asked her if she knew Kate Johnson, named a whole bunch of her friends, people they considered to be known homosexuals. She also admitted that she knew them. She thought there was nothing illegal about that. They taunted her about having sex with women, that she hadn't had sex with a man. She found it to be the most demeaning experience that she had ever had. She compared it to what she imagined was going on or had gone on in Nazi Germany. And the next day she resigned. The term was, she resigned voluntarily. Of course, it wasn't really voluntary, but she wanted to avoid any sort of, public notice about this or any sort of fight. She never worked in the government again. She was denied a Fulbright scholarship. She basically had to change careers, which was often true for people who lost their jobs. Later became an attorney and did civil rights work. We know thousands of people kind of did this. They resigned quietly. There's also evidence of a few number of people who, after these kind of brutal interrogations, committed suicide. Andrew Ferenz was a State Department employee in Paris. He worked at the American Embassy in Paris. He was interrogated in 1954 about his relationship with his roommate. He confessed to having a homosexual relationship with him. And after the interrogation, he went home to the apartment they shared in Paris, and he turned on the gas oven and asphyxiated himself. There's probably many more people who did this. We know about Andrew Ferenz because the State Department tried to cover up their part in this suicide. They made up a story, kind of cover story, that said that Andrew Ferenz committed suicide because of some bad health issue. And his family didn't believe it. And they had it investigated. They got a member of Congress involved. And when you get a member of Congress involved, there's a paper trail that's established. And so the papers of his case are in the National Archives, where I found them. I don't know how many people committed suicide. There's the evidence of a handful. But the State Department alone admitted that it had fired 1,400 suspected gay men and lesbians in the 50s and 60s. So I estimate that upwards of between 5,000 and 10,000 suspected LGBT people lost their jobs. Like Madeline Tress and like Andrew Ferenz. Eventually, and this is the good news, there are people who offer some resistance to this policy. Most people, like I said, resigned voluntarily. They just wanted it to be over. Frank Kameny was a little different. Frank Kameny was an astronomer. He had a PhD from Harvard. He had a degree in astronomy, a PhD in astronomy at the beginning of the space race, right? Thought he could basically do anything. He hoped to be an astronaut at some point. But he goes to work for the federal government. He's working for the Army Map Service. He's actually helping them map the face of the Earth, and so we can, better target our ICBM nuclear weapons. But he's fired in 1957. They discover an arrest. Frank Kameny had been arrested in a known gay cruising area in San Francisco. And so he's out of a job. And because it's, 1957, the Sputnik period, the space race, Frank Kameny can't find a job in astronomy anywhere. He's literally starving at one point. And so he decides to fight his dismissal. He also doesn't, because he's a kind of a nerdy scientist, he doesn't understand it. He doesn't understand why the government is concerned about his sex life. He thinks very logically, and he knows this has nothing to do with his ability to perform his job. So he fights it, first administratively and then through the courts, and he tries to take it to the US Supreme Court, but he's denied that effort. But in the process, he articulates this kind of new understanding of the Lavender Scare. He says, this is not about national security. This is not about morality. He says, this is about civil rights, right? This is about me and other people like me being treated as second-class citizens, just as racial or religious minorities sometimes are. So he more than anyone else makes this a civil rights issue. And as I said, he loses his personal struggle, but then he founds an organization in Washington, D.C. It's called the Mattachine Society. And by 1965, he and a small bunch, about a dozen of his activist colleagues are picketing in front of the White House, holding signs, right, claiming 15 million US homosexuals protest federal treatment. They weren't sure what was going to happen to them. They were pretty scared, the ones who did it first. And it was also April 1965. A lot goes on in April. And they continued to march. They marched in front of other government buildings. They marched in front of Independence Hall in Philadelphia. And probably more importantly, they brought other court suits through the federal court system. And by 1969, they're winning. They win a big court case. It's known as Norton v. Macy, where a federal appeals court basically says to the federal government, you can't prove a connection between these people's off-duty conduct, right, their sexuality, and their ability to perform their jobs. You have shown no connection. You have shown no evidence of this, and that's basically the beginning of the end of the Lavender Scare. But it's tenacious. The federal government changes very slowly. It even takes until 1975 until the civil service ends its sort of blanket policy of removing gay people. And then the Lavender Scare lasts essentially another 20 years in national security agencies, in the NSA, the CIA, the FBI, the State Department, anyone who needs a security clearance. That discrimination lasts into the 90s. It's not until Bill Clinton is elected president with a lot of LGBT support that in 1995, he finally signs an executive order rescinding Eisenhower's executive order and saying that the federal government does not discriminate on the basis of sexual orientation in hiring employees or in granting security clearances. So Frank Kameny luckily lives to see that day. He lives long enough to be invited to the Obama White House, to be kind of acknowledged as a hero, as a pioneer of the LGBT movement. At the very end of the Obama administration, the Secretary of State, John Kerry, actually apologized for the Lavender Scare. So Frank Kameny is kind of it's a happy ending to the story. He's a pivotal figure in it. And he's a pivotal figure in my own sort of knowledge of this story. When I met Frank, when I lived in Washington, D.C., he was an activist still. He was involved in the local LGBT organization. And he had collected and saved all of his papers. This is Frank literally in his attic with the picket signs that they carried in front of the White House in 1965 with all of his personal papers, the papers of his organization. And when I was privileged enough to meet him and he showed me his attic, I said, there's a book here, right? There's a project here. And returned essentially to graduate school to write that book, which became the Lavender Scare. This is outside the State Department. A couple years ago, in the summer of 2021, there was no Pride celebration under the Trump administration at the State Department, but under the Biden administration in 2021, they raised this new rainbow flag. And this is what the State Department spokesperson said on the raising of the flag. This was, I guess, in June for Pride. They said, today we fly the Pride flag for Andrew Ferenz and the numerous other colleagues who took their own lives when the State Department investigators confronted them, harassed them, intimidated them, and asked them about their sexual orientation and that of their friends and coworkers. So I was very proud of that moment that they had actually acknowledged Andrew Ferenz, that he sort of got recognized by the State Department. And now I'm happy to say that there are a bunch of states led by California that actually have mandated that LGBT people be recognized in the high school curriculum. I think there are 5 now. I don't know that Michigan is among them, but California, Illinois, New Jersey, Colorado, Oregon, Nevada. And the Lavender Scare is now part of the 11th grade curriculum in the California school system. At the same time, other states like Tennessee and Florida are actually passing bills to prevent the discussion of LGBT people in the high schools. So we are becoming even more divided, I think, as red and blue states. But as I said, it's my contention that this is not about being woke or anything. It's about more accurately telling the story of McCarthyism and the post-war panic over subversives. This is, someone once thought this was one of the Kennedys. He does look a little bit like the Kennedys there, but it's actually Billy Graham, right? Yes, it's Billy Graham, the preacher, friend to many presidents, who defended Joseph McCarthy. He liked what Joseph McCarthy did, and he defended him by acknowledging that he was, and thanking him for exposing what he called the pinks, the lavenders, and the reds, right? That sentence would make no sense to a student or anyone else who only studied the Red Scare. They would be like, well, what are these other colors, right? Pinks were essentially fellow travelers. They were a lesser version of a communist. They weren't, entirely red like a communist, but they were considered sympathetic to the communist cause, right? But lavenders, that's gay people. It's not entirely clear how lavender became the color associated with gay people at the time. It seems to be that it was because it's a mixture of red and blue or pink and blue. So it's, male, female colors, and homosexuality is usually associated with some sort of, gender inversion. So yeah, exposing the pinks, the lavenders, and the reds. Is what it was all about. Yeah, so what else can I do for you? What are your questions? What are your concerns?
Well, Dr. Johnson, thanks so much. We have time for maybe 1 or 2 questions, and then we want to just real quick sort of help teachers make sense of this for their own classroom. So Sarah, go ahead.
Oh, my question is, what one person inspired you to write this book? Who was your biggest inspiration in writing this book?
Well, it was Frank Kameny. It was meeting Frank Kameny. He, as Chris alluded to, he is quite a character. He doesn't suffer fools gladly. He's known to to get a little excited, get a little loud. He had a lot of self-confidence, and he was not going to be pushed around. So he's a very inspiring figure, and he, I mean, he basically devoted his whole life to this thing, and it wasn't something he chose, right? He was an astronomer. And not only for him, astronomy, it wasn't just sort of something he, chose to do at some point. It was a lifelong dream of him. Of his. He wanted to be an astronomer since he was a kid, and the government had prevented him from doing this. So he spent the rest of his life living as a activist for the community. It's why, I don't know if you can tell in these pictures, but if you see him he's in the film, for example, of the Lavender Scare. By the end of his life, he doesn't look so good. His teeth are kind of bad. His glasses are bad. His clothes are kind of disheveled because he never worked again, right, in a regular job. It really impacted his life and his well-being and his body. So yeah, I kind of wanted to figure out why the government, as he did, why was the government so concerned about, him being a threat to national security, him and others like him. So. And I will say that even he, who kind of became the person that everyone identified with, certainly the struggle to overturn the Lavender Scare and one of its main victims and kind of the expert on it. He wasn't a historian. He wasn't around in the early 50s. He didn't even know the extent of a lot of this. So yeah, it took some digging to bring up the whole story.
Chris, do we have time for one more really quick question?
Sure, go for it.
Okay. Dr. Johnson, you mentioned earlier that the letters that McCarthy received are still under seal. Why are they still under seal? And when do you think they may be released?
I think it's part of the agreement, the donor agreement when they were given to the university. It's for privacy reasons. So I think it ends when he has a daughter. I think he was an adopted daughter, I'm pretty sure, but a daughter nonetheless. And I think when she passes away, that they will be open, and the other records too. So.
All right. Thanks, Dr. Johnson. Again, feel free to jump in as we make this a little bit of a transition here. But we're going to talk a little bit about, and by the way, I want to acknowledge it's 7:59. So we know it's late, but I think we'd be remiss if we didn't really get to the practical application of what Dr. Johnson talked about for teachers. And so thinking about how we can use sources about hidden histories to help students better understand the past and navigate the present. We have some ideas about this. And, just as sort of a quick listing of these ideas, we think, first of all, that these are in direct alignment with the Michigan standards. And so we're going to talk about that briefly. Also, we think that the Pledge of Allegiance that Dr. Johnson mentioned is really part of the curriculum as well. And we're going to talk about just briefly how you could incorporate that as maybe an introduction to this. Also, the 52 and 56 presidential elections. Presidential politics tends to take front and center in American history classes, especially high school classes. And so we think that this lines up real well with that as well. But also, there's really this idea of finding hidden narratives through source work, the work that historians do, that we think as teachers you can present to kids in sort of a simulated way that might help them understand how historians do their work. We also think that this helps students, as we said, better navigate the present, that these issues are not limited to just the past, but connect to their lives right now. And that there is really this justice component to what the Lavender Scare does, and talking about resistance to injustice. And then finally, one of the things that Molly and Stacy and I always talk about is making sure that a textbook is not the final word on history, that is simply another source, and that we should be critiquing textbooks as well. And that we can do that with the Lavender Scare. So first off, there are 3 Michigan standards we think apply really well. This one is about the foreign policy during the Cold War. Now, if you read the standard carefully, it really it doesn't appear to have anything about the Lavender Scare in here. But one of the books that references that is really, I think, paired up well with Dr. Johnson's book is Imperial Brotherhood by Robert Dean. And Imperial Brotherhood actually has 3 chapters that talk very explicitly about the effect of firing homosexual employees in the State Department on later foreign policy, particularly the aggressive foreign policy during the Vietnam War. And so we make an argument that the Lavender Scare fits within this standard, because if it weren't for the firing of, as Dr. Johnson said, thousands of employees, the U.S. foreign policy might have been different during Vietnam. Also, more directly, the Lavender Scare really fits squarely within domestic anti-communism and McCarthyism, as listed in the Michigan Social Studies standards. So we really feel like the Lavender Scare fits within here really super clearly. And then finally, it's very explicit that civil rights being expanded should be included in the curriculum, that the major accomplishments and setbacks securing civil rights and liberties for all Americans, including the gay and lesbian community, should be included in the teaching of U.S. history in the state of Michigan. Okay, so you as a teacher are on very firm footing teaching about the Lavender Scare in Michigan. So how do we introduce students to this? One way, as Dr. Johnson mentioned, is talking about the Pledge of Allegiance. It's, every kid has to recite the Pledge of Allegiance in school. And so it's easy to begin a lesson as like a hook to say, does anyone know what the history of the Pledges of Allegiance is? And you can talk about how the Pledge of Allegiance has changed. It wasn't just one thing that was always the same ever and anon, but in fact, it was changed and modified. And you can focus on the specific adding of under God in the 50s, I believe, as a response to this sort of moral crisis during the Cold War. That's one approach, or one into discussing this, but also we think presidential elections is really important. As we said, political history tends to take a front seat in most US history classes, and presidential elections are really a huge part of that. And so talking about the presidential elections of 52 and 56, where Stevenson was running against Eisenhower, and reasons why Stevenson lost. In fact, I was reading one source today that said the issue of Stevenson's sexuality was even more pronounced in the 1956 election. And so talking about the fact that Stevenson would have been the first divorced president if he had been elected, and that one of the reasons why he lost was that people were questioning why he was divorced, and it revolved around issues of his sexuality, or rumors that he was not a heterosexual. Now, another thing that Dr. Johnson talked about, which we think is really, really interesting and important, is this idea of finding hidden narratives through source work. As we saw, this is a paper that talks about how one man died while abroad. And other articles talked about that he was a victim of a gas. It didn't really mention that it was a suicide, by the way. Just that he was a victim in a gas-filled French home, right? Real oblique kind of language. But when we come to this idea that Scott McCloud, which, by the way, when you Wikipedia search Scott McCloud, the second line in his Wikipedia entry is that he led the purge of homosexuals from federal employment. I mean, it's not hard to see that that there are often competing, but sometimes just sources that are telling different stories about the same set of events, right? And so if we rely exclusively on just newspapers, which I think most times teachers would respond well to newspapers being used as a historical source, but that we have to dig a little deeper sometimes. And so how do we present this to kids? Well, one of our thoughts is that there is like this sort of slow reveal you might have with students, right? Is that you put one source in front of them. Let's say it is this newspaper article. And you might ask them, all right, let's do a little source work around this around this newspaper article. What do you see here? What's the time period? What is this about? How might it relate to the Cold War? And then you maybe reveal another source which shows that the State Department tried to cover up this this death. Well, why might they try and cover it up? What was going on there? And so we really think that like a slow step-by-step, source-by-source reveal might be one way to begin talking about these hidden narratives and the different stories that sources tell about the same event. I think one quote I found that I really liked was that from an article from 2020, an academic article, it said, any common news reader, someone who would read this article right here that we see, would find no indication of government involvement with this death because it was very explicitly excluded from the story. The fact that the government was averse to the news of the reality of LGBTQ plus workers' death being revealed suggests that it knew on some level that its policies were partially responsible for them, right? So we think that if you have this, if you know about these hidden histories, one way to present it to students is a source by source reveal that shows them that there's one story and then there's possibly another story. And then they have to sift through what do these sources tell us about what was really going on. And this really gets to one of the key historical thinking skills that we care about a lot, which is corroboration, right? Do the documents agree? If not, why? What other pieces of evidence, what do other pieces of evidence communicate? Am I finding the same information everywhere? Am I finding different versions of the same story, right? And then I like this last question a lot. What else might I look to? What else might I look to find out more information about this topic, right? If we're reading something about a death of a State Department employee, then maybe we need to, in a newspaper, then maybe we need to go to the State Department and find out what the State Department had to say, right? There are lots of ways to get kids to think about what are some other sources that might be helpful in these circumstances. And then this example of Andrew Ferencz, we think helps kids can better navigate the present. We see now that Congress, as of a few years ago, wanted the State Department to begin to reckon with the Lavender Scare. This is from Foreign Policy. This is not an obscure publication. Also, the U.S. Department of State had a flag raising ceremony, as Dr. Johnson mentioned. And the quote from the speech was that, again, as Dr. Johnson said, today we fly the flag of Andrew Ferencz and the numerous other colleagues who decades ago took their own lives when State Department investigators confronted them, harassed them, intimidated them to disclose their sexual orientation, even out their friends and coworkers. So it's not that this issue exists in the distant past or even in the recent past. This issue affects us today. And I think having students understand that this is not some past event that they have to learn about in school to pass a test, but that it affects how they understand the world and how they interact with the world today. And maybe they have their own career aspirations. And if they are a member of this community, knowing that they are going to be able to have hopefully have be less harassed for their sexuality or whatever community they're a part of. I think that's empowering for students. And then also Kamini presents to us this lesson of resistance to injustice. As far as I could tell, Frank Kamini began publicly protesting 8 years before the Stonewall riots, right? And he was a part of the Mattachine Society, which was founded in 1951, although on the other coast, on the West Coast. But this idea that resistance to injustice often begins before the explosion we see later on in the Stonewall riots, right? That the work of civil rights happens for decades and years before it comes to public view. And that's what Frank Kamini really represents, is that resisting injustice, it only takes one, and then it turns into a community, and then it helps really make positive change. Harkening back to our January session with Dr. Nice, one of the things she talked about was teaching students to critique their textbooks as a source. And we think that fits right here as well, right? We have some materials here from some of our favorite organizations about LGBTQ history and why it matters. And one of their activities is actually a textbook analysis of their own textbook to see how people in the LGBT community are portrayed in the textbook and be able to critique that. The textbook is only one source. It is not the only source that students should be relying on. And until we begin critiquing those textbooks, we really are probably not going to be getting as full of a picture as we want. And so in summary, really the Lavender Scare is a case study in answering our compelling question, right? It is part of the lesser known part of the Red Scare, and it's rarely taught in schools. And if we only teach about the Red Scare, we're only telling part of the story of the Cold War. So when we talk about the Lavender Scare, we're talking about the Cold War. We're talking about the Red Scare. And you really can't, and as Dr. Johnson, you really beautifully portrayed, you can't understand the two parts of the Red Scare, the communists and the Lavenders, right? They went hand in hand in terms of the targets of the Red Scare. And some of the Billy Graham quote makes no sense unless we understand that, right? And so when you're teaching about the Red Scare, you really do have to teach about the Lavender Scare. It should be a part of it. So we're going to give you this. We're going to send this out later. This is the slides, and we'll put this in an email later. We'll also have this video available. And we also have our session with Peter Hammer and Heather Nice available as well. But we just want to thank you for coming to visit with us today. And again, we're going to put all this in an email to you later. So I'm going to stop sharing. And I want to thank everyone. I wasn't able to check any of the chats, but Molly, Stacy, I don't know if you wanted to jump in and chime in with anything before we part ways tonight. I know we're over time.
No, thank you guys for coming tonight. I just the whole time, and thank you, Dr. Johnson. I was definitely never taught about the Lavender Scare when I was in school. And you know, now I'm looking back and thinking, this is so important. How was I not taught this? So I'm just excited to have the opportunity to keep learning myself.
And I'll echo that. You guys, you'll find when you go out and start researching this, Dr. Johnson is like the guy. Like we accidentally found the Time magazine article that has Dr. Johnson. So we feel really honored and lucky that you agreed to do this with us tonight. We really appreciate your expertise and your time.
Happy to do it. Sorry if I went over my time. We're late.